Hey everybody, welcome back to Submarine History. Today, we start a series of briefings regarding U.S. submarines from 1775 through the end of World War II. In this briefing, we'll talk a little bit about the early days of submarine development, pre-1900, in the United States. One thing we will not talk about is submarine development by the Confederacy during the Civil War. We previously covered that topic in a three-part series of briefs on the H.L. Hunley. Our primary reference for this briefing is Norman Friedman's book, U.S. Submarines Through 1945, An Illustrated Design History, published by the United States Naval Institute Press in 1995. Please read the description to this briefing. It has references and links for further reading. Last, but not least, consider getting a USNI membership. USNI does not endorse or sponsor this channel, but the work they do to keep world naval history alive is invaluable. There's no way I could have started this channel without a source of information like USNI. If you have any questions or comments, please post them below in the comments section. I also have a Discord. You can find an invitation link on the channel page. And that is a great place to ask more in-depth questions. Okay, before we jump into the technical stuff, let's take a moment and talk about some of the early figures related to U.S. Submarine development. The top table is a list of pre-1900 U.S. submarine designers. As a comparison, the bottom table is a list of European submarine designers from the same period of time. Neither of these tables is comprehensive, but these are some of the more well-known figures from that period. A few things to point out. First of all, David Bushnell and Robert Fulton were the early American submarine designers. After Fulton, it's about 60 years before the Union and the Confederacy each look to submarines for their own purposes. You can see that Cornelius Bushnell, and I'm not sure if he's related to David, but he was actively building submarines in the U.S. around the same time as those Europeans listed. De Villeroy, while he did do some submarine design work in Europe, his big contribution was designing Alligator for the Union Navy while he was in the U.S. Monturio and Kroll, they developed non-military submarines that were more like diving bells, very sophisticated for their time. Monturio even incorporated air-independent propulsion for use submerged in one of his designs. Bauer, he's considered the father of German U-boat development. He's also acknowledged as influencing submarine design for the Union and the Confederacy. That's all I'm going to say now about Bauer and the other Euros. We'll talk more about him and the other Europeans in future briefings. Today, we talk U.S. Navy. David Bushnell. He grew up in a farming family and was the oldest of 5 children born to Nehemiah and Sarah Ingram Bushnell. After his father's death in 1769, he sold his interest in the family farm to his brother Ezra and entered Yale in 1771 at the age of 31. Not sure what Bushnell's major was at Yale. He was good at mathematics, but he seemed to spend a lot of time experimenting with gunpowder and proving it could be exploded underwater. He also co-developed the first mechanically triggered time bomb with a local New Haven inventor, Isaac Doolittle, as well as designing the first propeller. This skill set leads him to designing underwater mines and torpedoes. Now, back then, a torpedo was a spar-mounted mine projected ahead of a vessel that would steer to an enemy ship where you'd try to stick that mine into the ship's hull, get to a safe distance, and detonate. What we consider a torpedo, a self-propelled, hydrodynamically efficient, cylinder-shaped device with a warhead and contact fuse, that wasn't invented until 1866 in Europe by Whitehead and Lupus. So all these things Bushnell was experimenting with, he'd bring together to develop Turtle in 1775. And here it is, Turtle, a one-man submersible Bushnell designed and built in 1775 with the assistance of Isaac Doolittle, for the purpose of trying to break the British blockade of Boston Harbor. He mostly used his own money with some help from Doolittle and the state of Connecticut. Turtle's dimensions were approximately 10 feet long by 6 feet high and 3 feet wide. It had an elliptical shape that made it stable in water. It was made of 6-inch thick oak timbers bound with iron bands and coated with tar to make it as watertight as possible. It was normally a little positively buoyant with 6 inches of freeboard. Depth was controlled by a valve to flood the bilge, and that water in turn could be pumped out to rise. Once at near neutral buoyancy, the depth could be adjusted with a vertical propeller. There was 700 pounds of permanent lead ballast and 200 pounds of temporary lead ballast, which could be released in an emergency. Forward propulsion was by a bow-mounted horizontal propeller, which was operated by hand or foot, and stern-mounted rudder operated by hand. 3 knots speed could be achieved. And by the way, this is the first practical application in history of propellers for sea vessels. Turtle could operate submerged for about 30 minutes, but it also had snorkels that were just a little bit above the conning tower, providing a low surface profile. So how did they use this thing? The idea was to proceed to a target ship surfaced at night, then submerge as you closed the distance to the target, enough to get under the ship to screw a 150-pound black powder charge into the hull of the ship. The charge would have a clockwork mechanism connected to a flintlock firing mechanism, which would have set off the charge after Turtle, hopefully, got far enough away. By March 1776, the British had evacuated Boston Harbor, and Turtle was moved to New York Harbor for its first chance at combat on September 6, 1776. On that night, Sergeant Ezra Lee piloted Turtle out to HMS Eagle in New York Harbor and attempted to attach, unsuccessfully, its mine to Eagle's hull. 2 more unsuccessful attempts would be made towards the end of September. Finally, the decision was made to relocate Turtle to better hunting grounds, but on October 6, the sloop carrying Turtle was sunk by the British. You can see a replica of Turtle today at the Submarine Force Library and Museum in Groton, Connecticut, which is operated by the Naval History and Heritage Command Division of the U.S. Navy. 2 working replicas have been made, one in 1976 to celebrate the bicentennial, and one in 2007 that was used in the TV miniseries Turn: Washington Spies. And that episode was Season 2, Episode 8. All right, Robert Fulton. He was an American, and he did design torpedoes, mines, and submarines. However, he did it for France and Britain, not the U.S. I have him here on the list because he did design and build the world's first practical submarine, and that makes him notable. And his success in applying steam power to surface ships would lead to steam being one of the first types of power plants installed on submarines. His parents were Robert and Mary Fulton, and like Bushnell, he was one of 5 children. He spent 6 years of his youth in Philadelphia painting portraits, landscapes, and making technical drawings of structures and machinery. Having survived tuberculosis, he moved to England in 1786 on the advice of his doctor. A couple things Fulton did while in Europe. Well, wait a minute. So before we get to that, let's go back to Bushnell for a moment. After Turtle was lost, Bushnell would spend the rest of the war as an officer in the Continental Army, as a corps commander for sappers and miners. Upon his discharge in 1783, he returned to Connecticut, where he lived until 1787, then moved to France. Back to Fulton. When he arrived in England in 1786, he got interested in steam engines and the construction and operation of canals. There, in England, he worked on the idea of steam-powered surface vessels that could be used for commerce and transportation on rivers and canals. In 1793, Fulton moves to France, where it's speculated that he crossed paths with Bushnell. This is because not long after arriving, Fulton, with no known prior submarine interest or experience, starts design work on Nautilus, a human-powered submarine considered the first practical submarine design in the world. Nautilus's hull was constructed of copper sheets over iron ribs. It was 21 feet 3 inches long by 6 feet 4 inches in the beam and could hold a 3-man crew. Propulsion was provided by a hand-cranked screw propeller. A hollow iron keel acted as a ballast tank, flooded and emptied to change buoyancy. It also used horizontal fins as diving planes. A snorkel could provide air while submerged, and when surfaced, a collapsible sail was deployed for surface running. Nautilus was designed to carry a naval mine, okay, not a torpedo, with up to 200 pounds of gunpowder, which would be dragged into contact with an enemy ship. A device on top of the dome drove a spiked eye into the enemy's wooden hull. The submarine then released its mine on a line that went through the eye. When the long line had paid out, the mine would strike the target hull and explode by a detonator with a gun-lock mechanism. Fulton works on this design between 1793 and 1797. He unsuccessfully petitioned the French government directly to fund the project, but eventually he gets a commitment from the French Admiralty to consider purchasing the boat after Fulton builds it at his own expense and demonstrates its capabilities. Between 1800 and 1801, Fulton successfully tests the ability of the boat to submerge down to 25 feet and stay submerged up to 4.5 hours during government tests. These tests also showed that Nautilus could make 2 knots on the surface with its sail and travel faster underwater than a rowing team on the surface. Fulton also successfully demonstrated the dragged mine concept by destroying a 40-foot sloop provided by the French Admiralty. The French Admiralty was impressed, and they recommended to the French government the building of 2 submarines big enough to hold a crew of 8 with a submergence time of 8 hours. In spite of the successful tests, ultimately the French government declined to purchase any submarines from Fulton. In the end, the British government got Fulton to return to England and work on submarine designs for them, although that work would become unnecessary with the victory at Trafalgar. In 1806, Fulton returns to the U.S., eventually becoming famous for developing the first commercially successful steamboat. His work related to submarines would be left in England, and he would never return to that subject again. Brutus de Villeroi. Born in Tours, France, de Villeroi studied music and mathematics growing up and initially found work as a music and math teacher. He designed his first submarine in 1832, a teardrop-shaped vessel that had a crew of 3 with dimensions and displacement similar to Turtle. De Villeroi tried unsuccessfully between 1832 and 1837 to sell that boat design to the Netherlands and French governments. He immigrates to the U.S. in 1848 to start a sawmill business, but returns to France in 1851. He then gives the U.S. another shot and re-immigrates in 1856, this time pitching submarine designs to the U.S. Navy. He first designed and built a submarine for salvage purposes in 1859. This submarine would establish himself as a serious submarine designer for the U.S. Navy, who considered his initial effort a demonstration platform for future work. After the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, de Villeroi proposed a submarine design to the U.S. Navy that was larger than his salvage submarine and had potential to counter the threat of Confederate ironclads, which were known to be under construction at that time. The Navy offered a contract to de Villeroi in the fall of 1861 with the requirement to build the submarine in 40 days for the sum of $14,000. De Villeroi accepts the offer and initially supervised construction of the boat, but eventually left the program due to creative design differences with the U.S. Navy. Another interesting thing about de Villeroi, in 1842, when he was still teaching as a professor in France, it's speculated that he may have had Jules Verne as a student, the author of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Alligator was built from iron and measured 40 feet long with a beam of 4 feet 8 inches and a height of 5 feet 6 inches. She carried a crew of 18. 16 to operate hand-powered paddles, replaced the following year by a hand-cranked propeller. The hand-cranked propeller would give her a surface speed of 4 knots. Innovative things about Alligator. It had a snorkel system with forced air induction. That would be an air pump probably operated by foot. It had an air purification system. We'll talk about more of that in a second. It had an airlock for deploying divers, and it utilized electrically fired mines placed on a ship hull by a diver, then set off by a battery on Alligator after reaching a safe distance. Now, the air purification system. Boats being designed around this time, if they wanted more oxygen, compressed air bottles were around, and they could be stored on the boat. Alligator was different. Alligator could make oxygen and scrub CO2. I haven't found details on the process Alligator used to make oxygen, but it was known at that time how to use hydrogen peroxide with a catalyst, in this case manganese oxide, to generate oxygen. Now, in the literature, Alligator's CO2 scrubbing system is described as a bellows to force air through lime. I'm thinking they forced air through a filter with lime water, which is a solution, which is calcium hydroxide in solution. That reaction converts the CO2 to calcium carbonate compounds, which are captured in the filter, thus removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Even though it was supposed to be completed in 40 days, it ended up taking 180 days to design, build, and launch the boat on May 1st, 1862. The U.S. Navy accepted the boat on June 13th, 1862. They conducted trials, made improvements, and in general trained to work the boat up to a mission-ready state over the next 9 months. After a successful demonstration for President Lincoln on March 18th, 1863, it was decided Alligator would take part in the battle to take Charleston, South Carolina. To do that, Alligator had to be towed from Washington Navy Yard to Port Royal, South Carolina. Alligator would be lost off Cape Hatteras on April 2nd, 1863. 2 days into the journey when its tow, the USS Sumter cut Alligator loose during a storm. Cornelius Bushnell. Born in Connecticut, he becomes a commercial sailor at age 15, working his way up to master of a 60-ton schooner before he's 17. But he doesn't stick with it and ends up entering the grocery business with his brother, which he does for a while, then ends up investing in a bankrupt railroad and works to return it to profitability. With the start of the Civil War, he spends a short time with the militia defending Washington, D.C. until he's mustered out on May 4th, 1861. News of the Confederate Navy building an ironclad got Bushnell to design an ironclad for the U.S. Navy. After seeking design input from John Erickson, who was the designer of USS Monitor, Bushnell shelves his project in support of Erickson. So this leaves Bushnell with time on his hands. So in 1863, with his own cash and some seed money from the U.S. government, he gives submarine construction a try. What Bushnell comes up with is Intelligent Whale, designed by Scoville Merriam. It's iron construction, 28 feet, 8 inches long with a beam of 7 feet and a 9-foot draft. Human-powered and a crew of 6 to 13. Like Alligator, it will deploy a diver from an airlock to place a mine on the target ship and detonate it electrically from a distance. It was successful in initial trials, demonstrating its ability to dive and successfully attack a ship. Unfortunately, the successful trials and the prospect of a government contract threw control of the submarine into question, and that litigation wasn't resolved until 1869. At that time, the U.S. Navy took ownership of the boat. After additional unsuccessful trials in 1872, the entire project was abandoned. And today, Intelligent Whale is on display at the National Guard Militia Museum of New Jersey in Seagirt. And that's where we'll end this briefing. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, post them below. I do try to answer every comment. Till next time, peace out.